Hi everyone, I'm back to talk about more games in my Steam collection. Previously, I've made a video similar to this one where I reviewed almost all of the games that I played in my Steam collection since I first made my account from 2013 to the end of 2022. And this is a follow-up to that video now that a couple more years have passed. The purpose of doing this is for me to just share video game experiences I love with anyone who will listen. You'll get an idea of what I like and don't like about video games and which type of gaming experiences I gravitate towards. These were the games that I covered in the last video. This time the format will be a bit different as I'm not doing the scoring system, and I want to spend more time talking about each game individually, and any thoughts, additional context, or whatever discussions I think are necessary that will help communicate my full personal perspective on how I've been spending my time inside these games. There are less games to talk about this time, only 13, but each one will get plenty of time in the spotlight, as I'm sure you've been able to tell, because you've seen how long this video is. Please don't be scared. Don't click away. I promise I tried really hard to make this worth your time. Don't run away just yet. All the games are listed with time codes in the description if you want to take a peek at what I'll be talking about or to avoid spoilers for any particular game, because I will be talking about them with the assumption that you have played them. So without further ado, let's get started and see what I have to say about these games. First up, 12 minutes. Light content warning for this section, there are descriptions of domestic violence. This one was recommended to me strongly by a few friends because they knew that I really enjoyed Outer Wilds, and this game has a similar setup where there is a time loop involved that you have to figure out how to break in order to complete the game. And the only thing holding you back from doing that is your lack of knowledge on how to progress, which is learned through multiple iterations of the same time loop cycle. Exactly like in Outer Wilds. A bit more personal background for this game. I've been sort of on a time loop kick in the last 2 years. I've been trying to get my hands on mostly movies and TV shows that deal with time travel, just because I'm so fascinated by the whole concept and the different ways that people can write it. That 1 minute physics video really just blew my mind open about the whole thing, particularly the idea of being stuck in the same time loop and becoming a master of the timeline to the point of being perceived as omniscient to an outside observer. It is just such an alien concept from what we know and experience. Notable examples of this that I'm thinking of off the top of my head include a specific scene in the TV show Loki Season 2, as well as Travis Bible's short film Exit Strategy, and even also a book that I remember reading in middle school that I furiously dug up and devoured again called The Power of Un by Nancy Etchemendy. All this is to say that I was very excited to see how 12 minutes would fare in my internal collection of similarly told stories. And I have to say that the setup of a man trying to prevent his wife from being dragged away and killed by a terrifying guy voiced by one of my faves, Willem Dafoe, was really neat, if terrifying. The way that events play out is potent, to say the least, I think in part because it is such a small, focused story on only 3 characters and their interactions with each other. So every action that I took and the consequences that it led to made me feel like it really mattered, even if I watched the same thing happen 10 or 12 times. The general plot line of the man trying to kidnap and kill me and my wife, only for the tension to slowly start to de-escalate as all of us really bit by bit figure out what's really going on before ending on an apparently peaceful resolution, was, in essence, a real treat to explore. Because how often does it happen that the narrative of a piece of media has a conflict resolution in a way where everyone ends up more or less resolving their differences and misunderstandings without it ending in a huge, fight, punches and everything. I mean, this game does have punches, but you're not punching out the bad guy to end everything. It's refreshing. However, unfortunately, I felt extremely conflicted with what the actual physical and mental experience was like to play this game. First off, moving around in this game is physically frustrating to do. I don't know if it's because they were trying to strike some sort of balance with making these characters move as close as possible to how they actually would in the real world, but physically telling the husband where to go and what to do felt overly cumbersome and awkward. Several times I was thinking to myself, I would rush into this room or closet a lot faster and differently if I was actually in this situation and not conveying my actions through a keyboard. And I failed the time loop several times because I was just a bit too slow to make what I wanted to happen, and it felt sort of cheap and unfair. So that was frustrating. But the main frustrating thing was actually that I felt like for the longest time that I could not really figure out how to progress past a handful of points or even understand what the end goal is kind of supposed to be besides this vague notion that I have to protect the husband and the wife from being attacked by this man. Now, I understand that's sort of the point, but just whatever I tried to do to change the course of events, it seemed that nothing really stuck, and I did not feel like I was being afforded a fair understanding or level of guidance to help me figure out how to progress. I ended up using a walkthrough for several parts, and at the time I blamed the game for forcing me to do out-of-pocket and wild things so I could understand what options were even available at all. I did think that it was unfair at the time, and I did not look fondly back on it for a while. But that being said, I did think about it more, and I asked the question, is it really fair to call the game unfair because of that, given the fact that I had literally all the time in the world to try whatever I wanted? And if something didn't work out, just restart the cycle. Is that what 12 minutes is trying to prepare me to do anything and to experiment with any and all combinations of actions just to figure out the correct way forward, no matter how weird, insane, or brutal it appears to be? Is that what it means to truly be a master of the timeline? Because if that's the case, it might be the fact that I just was not prepared to do that. I think that partially had to do with the fact that the things you can do in this game are very violent in a domestic setting, so I personally was thinking that I was going to try to make that happen as little as possible, because I'm a pacifist, and I didn't consider that it might play a more involved part in figuring out the correct way forward than I might have hoped for. Like, I don't want to drug my wife with medication to knock her unconscious, even if that means that it buys me a few more seconds of time to figure out what to do as the bad man puzzles over why she's not waking up. But that's something you have to do. Apparently, in this universe, the only way of reaching a peaceful resolution to the situation is drugging people, electrocuting people, probably a handful of other things that my brain has sort of filtered out. So maybe I just wasn't cut out for what I was getting myself into at the time. It did make me think about something else, though. Can you imagine a story where the main character is suffering the weight of the world's issues, and they're somehow given from on high a list of tasks that tell them to do wild and seemingly disconnected and insane, definitely illegal things because the combined butterfly effect would result in the quickest way to solve all of the world's problems? Imagine if one person had this clear shot at the golden path like that, and they just, commit a couple murders, throw some things at passersby, eat this instead of that for lunch. I think that would be an insane story to write if it hasn't been done already, and let me know if it has. That's the type of thing a game like 12 Minutes really made me think about. Anyway, this game had definitely caused a lot of internal conflicts as I played it, and I can't say that I don't respect it for putting me in that position, as that's exactly the type of circumstance that I guess that I would expect from a game that is published by Annapurna, the company that I and others sort of see as the A24 of video game publishers. But it sucks because I can't go back and play this game and see it the same way again because my playthrough was marred by frustration coupled with an external feeling of urgency to play through this and just get it finished. Not necessarily because I wanted to get it done just to say I completed it, but mostly due to the fact that I didn't think that the game was supposed to take me very long, and it was very easy for me to want to just internally drop it once I decided that I should be wrapping it up after a certain point. It's not a good way to play games, I understand that. Unfortunately, this probably won't be the last time that a similar sentiment comes up in this video. So, all in all, this wasn't the best video game time travel experience I've had by far, but I can't say that I didn't learn a lot from it. And also on a last note, I didn't like the ending to this game. I would have been very happy if everything had just stopped with the resolution between all the characters, but I guess it turns out you can't have a happy ending anymore. Sorry. There might be a good reason why the twist ending is there that ties into the larger narrative, but it felt tacked on to me and I don't have the drive to go back and revisit it. So that's 12 minutes. Now, I mentioned that while I was playing 12 Minutes, I used a walkthrough, which I imagine is horrifying to some of my regular audience members. I see you guys. But I want to stick with this idea of keeping a walkthrough handy for the puzzle games that I've been playing. Sorry. With that, I'm now going to talk about Animal Well. And yes, like everyone else, I heard about this game through Donkey, and despite never playing nor caring to play any sort of Metroidvania-style game, I gave this one a shot. because, you trust the dunk. Put it on the wish list and everything. And I have to underline this when I say that this game has made me so happy when I played through it. I've had games delight me in several different ways, whether that be through the enjoyment of how they're bending my mind through different puzzles, or giving me a certain satisfaction through moving through a space, or absolutely flooring me with their environments and world building and characters. And several games do many or all of these things, but almost none of them do it in such a condensed and cozy and utterly vibe-tastic way like Animal Well does. I think I run the risk of just listing off a bunch of aspects of this game right now where my commentary is just going to consist of, I love this, or that was such a vibe, and I'm going to try to avoid that. But the color palette, the unique items, the sound design, the dreaminess of all of it, that's the word that I keep coming back to, dreaminess, which saturates this entire experience like a thick, weighted, and heated blanket. It's made up of so many factors that just naturally fit together. The cuteness of the little blob main character, blowing bubbles with the bubble wand, hearing it sound exactly like you would expect it to sound, hitting the hanging lights and having the light rays scatter all over the place. I actually purposefully hit the lights an obscenely unnecessary amount of times during my playthrough because I just couldn't get enough of it. And the animals in the Animal Well, this is like everything my inner child needed to fulfill my love for all of these creatures. I can't put into words how much I find these creatures cute, but also, spooky and elegant and just full of wonder that leaves me with nothing but full infatuation and appreciation for them. And there's plenty more besides the animals themselves. I think one of the best choices the game made was to have no ambient music at all for most of the game, except for specific endgame sequences and the menu and the save rooms. And even in the save rooms, it's extremely understated. Somehow the sparseness of the ambience and the combinations of the environmental sounds only accentuates the game's dreamy feeling, which notably I've only felt in one other game to this extent, which would be The Witness. It does just enough to give you a warm welcome when you go to save your spot, but other than that, you're in this world that simultaneously feels like it was made for you to explore, but it's also foreign enough to you that you can always expect at least a little danger or something lurking around every corner. The game literally feels exactly like a surreal dream in this way. I've had so many dreams with this exact feeling. Familiar setting that clearly exists in this perpetual night where everything is a bit uncanny in the most delicious sense possible. It's spooky, haunting, and this all really comes out in the endgame where you take to the starry sky and go through the final sequence of events that only comes out of the times when you've slept through something that you can't quite tell is a wonderful dream or a weird nightmare. It's so vibrant in everything that it does that I have a hard time thinking of other games that are quite like it. At the risk of getting too sentimental, let's tie the walkthrough back into it. Animal Well has multiple layers or levels of completion. I had gotten through what I think most people consider the first two well enough by myself, which means defeating the main monster and collecting the eggs and escaping the well. But, of course, there are still one or two layers of extremely obscure puzzles to solve beyond that, stretching into the ARG realm, poking at the game's code, and requiring the coordination of many different real-life players, and performing tasks that no one in a million years would ever think to do, just to see if it makes anything happen. Not in a million years. And of course, people had them all figured out within the first year of the game's release, probably just the first few months due to data mining and all that stuff. Once I had an idea of how complicated these things were going to be, my internal clock was like, nope, that amount of work that I have ahead of me to brave those waters is something that I just cannot commit to. So I gladly used a walkthrough to figure out the rest of the puzzles, making sure to do as much as I could in the game itself with just written instructions instead of relying on screenshots or videos. In the case of Animal Well, I think I was much more justified in going with my internal clock on this one because, again, unless you data mine, no one was expected to solve some of these puzzles for a very, very long time. And it was here that I really realized that I could view walkthroughs as not just a tool to help you get to a certain point in a game, or more likely, get past a certain point in the game, but also as a welcome guide that could serve as part of the conversation that I have with the game itself when I ask it in some form or another, what are you trying to show me? What are you trying to tell me about yourself? Before, I had sort of spurned walkthroughs as a concept completely, only thinking about the idea of using them as number one, an admission of a personal failure to mentally stack up against what the game was giving me, or number two, when I was too stubborn to accept number one, as an appeal to the ultimate arbiter of fairness, where the walkthrough would at least act as the referee in determining whether a puzzle was fair and reasonable for me to expect myself to solve, however I define that at any given time. But with this slight tweak in perspective, where I used a walkthrough to help me understand what the game is trying to tell me, I was able to see Animal Well to the very end and find its deepest secrets, or at least the deepest secrets that everyone seems to agree are currently the deepest ones. And I was able to finally sit back on the couch with my headphones on in front of a colorful TV, knowing that I had come home from a truly complete journey that told me everything I wanted to know about this wonderful adventure that I'd been on. And it was perfect, and everything was all right. And I didn't have to do it completely by myself. Of course, I just talked about using the walkthrough, so in that sense I wasn't completely by myself, but also one of my closest friends happened to be playing through Animal Well at the same time as me, and they were only a Discord call away. They had started before I did, so both of us were in the position to watch the other person play catch-up. This time I was in the role of the person who did not know what the other person already knew, which I noted was interesting because typically I'm the one who is showing a game to somebody else, watching them play it for the first time, so I have all the knowledge. I thought of the several times that I would show a game like Submachine to someone and watch them try to figure out the puzzles in real time, trying as best as I could to use my eyes to x-ray their mind and see the gears turning and to be ecstatic when they had that aha moment that I could see coming. But now I'm on the other side of that. It made for somehow an even more comforting experience, and it was also a good setting for me to feel good about playing a brand new game while not being totally immersed in only the game world and my own singular thoughts in my head about it. I would never live stream a blind playthrough of Animal Well or almost any other game, even if you gave me 10,000 viewers for it, because that's how much I value playing games for my own conversation only. But I could afford to share this one with one of my best friends. It was also hilarious when we went back to playing it on our own, and we had to figure out how to continue to talk about this game with each other without accidentally spoiling the other person. That was a weird, dance that I don't get to experience very often. So that's Animal Well. For this next game, I'm actually going to stay on the topic of using walkthroughs. Now that I've accepted the walkthrough as a new kind of tool in my arsenal, it allows me to fully talk about Baba Is You. Like Animal Well, this game has layers to it. Sheesh, it's got layers to it. Not necessarily as many layers as Animal Well, maybe, I guess technically there's only 2, but the thing is that the second layer of this one requires so much mind-bending to traverse that I knew eventually I would just have to have a lot of assistance to progress. But I gave it my fair shot. I gave it a fair shot. This game has perfected the type of gameplay that it offers, which is a sort of Sokoban block setup, but each level has rules as to how each block of every type of element inside the level can act, and you can follow these rules, or break them, physically, or change them completely in order to win each level. And this leads immediately to some very out-of-the-box solutions for puzzles that would otherwise seem impossible to solve. Baba Is You takes this concept and explores every possible aspect of it, with each level teaching you something new about how an element works by forcing you to demonstrate it yourself. So the experience turns out to be one of those types of games that is about learning and understanding a concept through a series of exercises that are almost academic in nature, packaged as it's like a university course that's packaged as this extremely cute adventure. You're not just playing a puzzle game, you're taking a course at Baba University. And the first crack that I took at Baba was a prolonged one where I was able to immerse myself into the flow of solving puzzles and enjoying the effects of the things that I was doing immensely. And I definitely felt my brain being rewired and pushed and pulled and plasticized while doing it. That's only accentuated by the fact that due to the nature of the puzzles, with their definitions and rules and words and whatever, I felt like I was being sneakily taught how to code the entire time, and the programming language is expressed in cute animals and funky pixelated operator words. If that's the intent, it is the most programming I've ever done at one time by far. And what really hammered home the parallel was when I would be stuck on how to solve a level for a good long period of time, and I would step away from it and give myself a break. And then, sure enough, I'd think about it again, and the solution would pop into my head, either while taking a walk or just sitting on the toilet. And that made me think, oh, this same thing happened in the programming classes that I've taken. Those aha moments were amazing. I live for that sort of thing where it just clicks. And as it goes, after a while, the puzzles got harder, and my attention turned to other things, and I got out of the groove, so to speak. So I couldn't as easily remember all of the things that I could do with the rules that I knew. But what I did know was that this game has secrets in wacky places, because I had discovered some puzzles that seemed to break the entire level themselves, and even the overworld in which the levels were situated. I knew that Baba Is You was going to make everything unravel in this wild way. I had enough faith in the game to do so by that point, so I once again turned to a hint guide to help me to the end, a beautiful one by Key of W. And then eventually the wiki, when even the hint guide couldn't completely save me. I really respect Baba Is You for introducing a great concept for people to play with and fully exploring all versions of it and setting up the game in a way that allows you to slowly but surely become the master of that concept. This was something that was present in Antechamber, the game that convinced me to get a Steam account, and this sort of puzzle game is something that I've sought out ever since then. There are 2 other games on my list that also do a fantastic job of teaching you in the way that Baba teaches you, those being Creaks and Cocoon, and I'll talk about those next. But Baba is at the top of that genre of game for me, I think, just due to the sheer volume of course material that it offers. It's huge, and even when everything starts falling apart, it just does so perfectly. The last thing that I'll say about Baba is that I absolutely love how everything is simultaneously extremely cute, but also monstrous at the same time, with the darkness seeping in immediately when you make a wrong move, and the level is broken, trapped in the void forever, until you hit the undo button and then you're right back at it as if nothing happened. It is just so funny how casual the game is in pairing consistent, adorable characters with concepts that I think are fundamentally eldritch in nature, all painted with the same cutesy pixelated brush. The music is also super catchy. I don't think it'll join the ranks of my personal library that includes soundtracks that I'll be listening to until I die, like Mirror's Edge and Cairo, Naissance, the Talos Principle, and of course, Machinarium. But the Baba soundtrack almost doesn't have to exist in my physical library at all because it is full of earworms that my brain will put on all by itself whenever it wants. It's great. I love the game, I love its scope, and I love Baba. The supreme chaos agent that he is. Look at this creature. Be fearful of what it contains within. So now let's touch on Creaks and Cocoon, which, like Baba, offer this chance to become the master of a couple of closely tied together puzzle elements. In the case of Creaks, this takes the form of a dense network of mazes where you learn about 4 or 5 enemy types and explore every aspect of their strengths and weaknesses. It's pared down quite a bit compared to what a game like Baba is doing, but it's still a complete experience that does its job perfectly. I've heard several people say that when Creaks came out, it became their favorite game by Amanita Design due to the puzzles being so successful at keeping your nose to the grindstone with learning about these enemies' mechanics, and I completely understand that. Also, I don't know if it feels right to call these enemies, as all of these animalized pieces of furniture are either cute or elegant or otherwise charming, even if they're out to get me. I see the dog barking at me ferociously, and I want to pet him, even if it's going to take my arm off because it's a cute dog. And because this is an Amanita Design game, the game's aesthetic is beautifully crafted, but inevitably has some sort of aspect to it that is much darker and stirs some sort of primal fear or something inside of me. Rather than the feeling of the world coexisting with some sort of mildewy, tendony rot like I remember from Botanicula or Machinarium, this time I'm feeling it from the storybook-like moving paintings that are peppered through the larger children's story framework that Creaks takes place in. It's very hard for me to describe why these paintings evoke some sort of feeling of something being off-kilter. I want to say it's related somehow to the fears that people get out of seeing baby dolls, of what, I get that that can be creepy, even if I don't personally have a specific aversion to it. But I think it's more something about the slightly crude construction of the puzzle boxes, evoking a kind of childlike quasi-medieval setting. The painted faces that are only afforded so much detail in such a small space. I don't know. If I think about it for too long, I start getting freaked out. It's delicious because of that. And somehow this works fine with an extremely jazzy soundtrack that is super satisfying to hear ramp up when the snippets are perfectly timed with you figuring out that crucial part of the puzzle that you need. The final boss battles music is actually so catchy and danceable that I've put it in my rotation for music that I spin in DJ sets. So, all in all, very nice experience to have. Now, in the case of Cocoon, this type of setting is immediately my jam. Even though I love the worlds that Amanita Design makes, I always mentally hold them at arm's length a bit. Maybe half an arm's length. Not because of the creepy elements, I just recognize that their game style is one that I like, but I don't absolutely love. Or maybe it's the opposite. I love it. I love it for everything that it is, but I just don't like it as much as the others. I don't know. Take your pick. Anyway, Cocoon is right up my alley. I was excited to hear that it was designed by Jeppe Carlsen, who worked on Limbo and Inside, because this game is bright and colorful and a huge stylistic departure from those two because of it. Which is not to say that it's completely free from anything potentially icky, because everything in this game is bugs. Bugs in a microscopic environment, but I like bugs, for the most part, so it's fine. The puzzle design is crisp, the sounds are immaculate, but the big attractor is the setting of jumping in and out of pocket dimensions contained in orbs. The puzzles are built around manipulating these pocket dimensions and carrying them inside and outside each other, and that absolutely delighted my sci-fi brain. Like Baba in Creaks, you get to explore every aspect of what it means to manipulate these worlds against each other, and for the longest time it feels like everything is perfectly contained and laid out for you, which is what makes the later third of the game hit so hard when those boundaries and rules start to be bent a little bit. Baba Is You has a huge portion of the entire gameplay experience dedicated to flat-out breaking physics and seemingly the logic of the entire game, so you get used to things being weird, whereas in Cocoon, the presence of many worlds made me feel like that sort of thing might be inevitable, but it followed its rules until the very end, when I realized all of a sudden that I had a pocket dimension inside of itself, and I immediately thought, oh no, something has gone terribly wrong. Someone please come pick me up, I'm scared. And then the game thankfully ends soon after that, so in contrast to Baba, rather than reveling in everything coming apart, it gives you just a taste at the very end, and I think that's pretty cool. While I was playing Cocoon, I also became aware of how the environment is built in such a way that you are clearly supposed to be exploring this bigger world that is implied to exist, whether you're there to experience it or not. But ultimately, due to the nature of the game's structure and how you are led through each bit of the puzzle mastery exactly when the game wants, it's ultimately designed for you alone. This isn't something present in Baba because Baba doesn't really bother with much of a story or world building to situate you in. Creaks does have a solid story and the cutscenes are very nice, but it's also easy to sort of separate the story from the puzzle sections and treat them as their own experiences, even if they are tied to the same world. Cocoon's world building and puzzles are much more interwoven, which makes their connections much more interesting. It made me reflect on all of the puzzle games that I've played and how they each choose to recognize this balance and interaction. The first Flash room escape games I ever played had a very simple premise of being upfront with the mission to tell you to escape, with the environment just providing different backdrops for that. Naissance's puzzles mostly have you figuring out where to go next, and even though the entire environment is built for you to figure out, it's very easy to think that you're just a small part of this otherwise careless world, or even that it wasn't built to be used by anyone like you at all. Meanwhile, the Talos Principle and Portal make the fact that you're solving puzzles directly part of the story itself, and the entirety of Inside is heavily theorized to all be one giant puzzle built for you, and theories abound as to how many layers of meta-analysis the game is intentionally recognizing the amount of control that you have, not just as the protagonist, but also the real-life human player. All of these things make Cocoon a wonderful, complete package that, more than anything, make me feel overjoyed that there are so many great indie puzzle experiences out there for us. And there are still more indie puzzle games that I want to talk about, but for the next game, I want to shake things up a bit and talk about something completely different. Have you ever had the experience of riding passenger in the car or on the train and have caught yourself staring out the window imagining that there was some sort of little runner guy running alongside you, maybe vaulting over and weaving around the buildings or trees or power lines flashing by, or the distant hillside scrolling past? I feel like a lot of people have constructed some sort of simple game afforded by the motion in a vehicle to pass the time like this. I've come up with a couple different such games depending on what I was seeing. One that I think is probably a bit more unique is a game that I play when I'm riding specifically in the passenger seat on a road that has tall trees on both sides. And what this means is you can look up and forward through the windshield and see the edges of the tree lines creating this V shape against the sky that is constantly fluctuating in width as different branches that are closer together or farther apart rise up from the bottom in your view. Keeping this in mind, what I would do is recognize that while I was focused on the trees, there would inevitably be some sort of speck of dirt or whatever on the windshield, probably appearing as two specks because my eyes would be focused on the trees behind them. And I would pretend that I had to sort of guide these two images of the speck down this corridor of trees racing by, tilting and moving my head so that the specks would bob and weave between the changing left and right boundaries of the trees. It's sort of a more complicated, like, tunnel runner sort of situation. If you ever find yourself in this situation, I recommend seeing if you can make it work. But also, full disclaimer, I don't take any responsibility for any head or neck injuries that might occur. And because this little game that I came up with is pretty easy to naturally play, and because of its vertical orientation, I thought it might be interesting to see what that looks like when translated into an app for your phone, maybe using your fingers to move the two dots around. Just a little time waster, you know. I don't know how fun it would actually be, but maybe one of you can pick it up as an idea for a coding project or something. That's right, the app does not exist yet, to my knowledge. I don't even know what I would search for, to be honest. Perhaps some experiences are meant to be fully enjoyed without a phone involved at all, but what intrigues me the most about this, to get to the point, is a game with an extremely simple but weird motion concept that on paper is not immediately clear how well it would work. And that's what the next game, Exo One, is all about. The motion concept here is completely different from the ones in our imaginations. In this one, you're a ball that has to traverse different terrains of varying heights, and the only big tool that you have to accomplish this is your ability to control the gravitational attraction of the ball towards the ground. You can make yourself fall faster, which means you can generate speed by rolling along the ground as the ball tries to find the lowest point, then finding a spot where the ground raises up and ramping off of it. It's like Venonith, but you can make yourself fly around by rolling. You can also turn the ball a bit like in Venonith, and when you're airborne, you can also flatten the ball into a pancake and glide, fly even, to extend your range. If you get high enough to reach the clouds, you can also catch air currents and thermals to propel your gliding even farther. To me, this is exactly the type of concept that I imagine someone thought of without fully understanding whether this is something feasible at all. Maybe it started off as something they just found themselves doing to pass the time, like you and I do with our imaginative games in the car. Or maybe they scrawled it on a bar napkin or whatever. But then they went for it and developed it. And it works beautifully, which is to say, it takes a bit of practice to develop a rhythm for understanding this movement, so there's a bit of a learning curve. But once you build the momentum, you can fly through the environments on the different planets you find yourself on. It's addicting to see just how long I can hold out flying over this beautiful mountain range, or how many times I can ride sand dunes in a row, catching them at just the right tangent to gracefully swoop out of them somewhere else. It is a completely different type of gaming experience that I think everyone should try. And you can right now, because there's a free demo of the first level on Steam. It's a type of game that I can easily see myself revisiting and idly playing the individual levels over and over again because this mechanic is simply so much fun. And to confirm this, I opened it up just now again to play a few levels, and now it's about 2 hours since I wrote the previous sentence in this script. It is such a weird style of play, but it also feels really good once you get it, and I'm not even mentioning the other quirks that these mechanics have. And I really applaud the developers for making something completely new to wrestle with, because we need more quirky stuff like this. This game is what it means to push gaming forward. Now, Exo One also has a story attached to it, fed to us mostly through visions we see of far-off planets and snippets of dialogue about a previous mission to Jupiter that went wrong. It's a bit open-ended into how our player fits into all this. It turns out we're not just a flexible marble, but the flexible marble is itself a spaceship. But I'm not as interested in piecing the details of the story together as much as I am recognizing that the game's world building for the story is very heavily inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey, which you could probably tell from like A Mission to Jupiter going wrong, as well as the 1997 movie Contact. There are very direct references to 2001's Stargate sequence, the mission talked about in the story, finding something in Jupiter like 2001. Earth received plans to build our spaceship via a echoey alien signal. And, just like in Contact, and we have to trust these plans were built by the aliens correctly to protect us humans, which is a pretty key plot point in Contact, in the movie at least. Now, for those of you who watched the previous video where I talk about games in my Steam library, you might have remembered me not taking too kindly to certain games that are very heavy-handed in their borrowing of ideas from other games that came before them. In particular, I mentioned that I criticized Superliminal for doing this to the point that I thought it used similar ideas to other games more as essentially a crutch to bolster its unique but underdeveloped mechanics. And I'm not biased. I'll point out when my absolute favorite developers plaster references everywhere. Notably, Mateusz Skutnik has done this a lot throughout the Submachine games and also Slice of Sea. Slice of Sea has so many Subnautica fish. It's a lot. I can't show all the places where the Subnautica fish are, actually. I don't want to spoil that for anyone. And I haven't played Subnautica, so I see those and I know they're from a different game. And sometimes when this sort of thing does happen, I have to ask the question of, when the developers make overt or covert references to other games, which instances are done out of sort of this clean respect to the media in question, and what other times is it done because they're just trying to cash in on a cheap emotional connection that they know other people will also enjoy seeing? Or worst of all, when is it a case of just reusing ideas that other people thought of first because they can't think of anything interesting themselves? These are the dark questions we're asking here. It is a pretty tough accusation. I think in Superliminal's case, I ended up characterizing it as the second of those three. And now it turns out that Exo One is a game where its core story directly references two science fiction movies that happen to be some of my favorites. And I recognize the direct references and I see them as such, but for some reason I don't feel compelled to knock this game for doing it. Call me a hypocrite, maybe it's because it's referencing creations from a different medium, but we now have this game that allows us to be directly controlling and immersed in story beats that we could only previously watch through a TV screen. Maybe I'm showing favoritism because I really like Contact in 2001, but after playing Exo One for the first time, I eventually did go back to Superliminal and I gave it a second chance, and I have to be honest, I don't really think my soft accusations that the game reuses ideas seen in Portal and whatnot to its detriment are really to its detriment. If anything, the fact that they're not the same really points to the fact that artists reuse borrowed ideas and stuff from artist creations all the time. And most of the time, they do put their own unique spin on it or simply use it in a different context that imbues it with its own flavor. They're remixing it, and just as I would have no problem with hearing 4 or 5 different remixes of a techno track, I can see that as an opportunity to explore an idea and how it looks through multiple layers of perspectives from other people. So I should be okay with the same thing happening in games as well. And even if the authors, splurge a little bit with it or not, there's a lot of Subnautica fish. You know what? I think that's okay too. These are pieces of art made by humans who have been impacted and molded by the stories that came before them. And if they want to put something in their game that says, I really love this thing that inspired me and drove me to create my own stuff, then that is a critical message about themselves that they are sharing with us that I think we should recognize and accept. Kojima, has the confidence to put basically Mimir Wiseau and also the literal crow into Death Stranding 2, and everyone accepts it and says, that's just Kojima. And I think that's fine, so I also think it's probably okay what Superliminal does, and I'm also happy to see Exo One's Stargate, and I'm happy about the Subnautica fish. I'm happy about it because they're happy about it. I care because they do. Otherwise, I won't be able to listen to like half the catalog of groups like Underground Resistance, because those producers make a lot of tracks that share all of the same musical ideas. And who knows, when an idea is copied enough times, it often just becomes the visual language for the medium. Perhaps if we see the Stargate enough times, that will just become the trope for what it looks like to traverse time and space. It seems now that we've accepted a new form of what a black hole looks like. It's not just the interstellar black hole anymore, though admittedly I think that one was based on better scientific findings. And the vertigo camera effect is now simply a filmmaking technique called the dolly shot, instead of just being like the thing that Vertigo did. It's now like a staple of filmmaking. So all in all, we probably don't need to get up in arms about whether people creating art are being cheap when they reference things that inspire them. Who wants to make the time to be a downer like that anyways? We've got enough to worry about. Okay, now that I've finished my manifesto, let's talk about a puzzle game that has its own unique mechanics. Return of the Obra Dinn gives you a special sort of watch that allows you to travel back in time to the deaths of each person aboard a mysterious trading ship, and use environmental details, context clues, and some bits of logic to fill out this ledger, naming all 60 people that died, what their job was, and how they died. I really like the premise of this game, but unfortunately I rushed it. Because I just got impatient with how much time I was spending on playing it again, and after a while I was running out of ideas about how to tell each person on board the ship apart from each other. I got, I think, just over halfway by myself, and if I wasn't feeling pressured, maybe I could have uncovered like 5 or 6 more people's fates, but it wasn't to be, so I turned to the walkthrough because with this game I really wanted to see what the developer wanted me to notice and pick up on. I think most of the clues were probably ones that I could tease out if given like until the end of the universe, but some of them were a bit too obscure, so I'm not sure I would call them completely fair. I think some of the clues in Obra Dinn would have gotten lost in the noise of the game's artistic styling, which is this really neat, like, I guess you call it 1-bit style that makes a game set in the 1800s look like it was made in the 1980s. So there's a lot of interesting notions about time being explored here just through the game's presentation. And that 1980s look comes in different color variations too, so pick your favorite for no other reason than you can. You may as well have your favorite color combo with you when the pocket watch decides to show you this brand new opening shot of some of the most visceral deaths that I could ever imagine to happen to someone on the high seas. Some of them are really messed up to think about, and the game's art style simultaneously highlights the important bits while also sometimes forcing the player to take a second to make out exactly what grisly fate each person on board suffered. It's haunting, and it's awesome. One thing I thought was interesting about Obra Dinn was that this game could have been much more annoying about having you set out to achieve your goal of figuring out what happened to all 60 people. You go out to the ship, you have to fill out the logbook and make sure everything's correct before you return to shore, because you only get one chance to visit the ship because the restitution payments to the victims' families in respective countries can only be sorted out once. In real life, there would be no communication from on high that all 60 names in your book are being accurately recorded as you go, so you'd have to just trust your observation and deduction skills. But thankfully, the game has a narrator of a sort that clearly tells you when you've completed every 3 names on the list correctly, and they're locked in for good. This narrator also explains the tools in your logbook clearly and succinctly, setting you up to be the experienced chief inspector that you are. And every line and scene introduction gets its own lick of orchestral seafaring tunage. We love that. We get to feel official, learned, distinguished, smart. That was a nice feeling, while it lasted at least. Ironically, as the game progressed, the logbook's mechanism of unblurring a character's face on the group photo when you've had enough information you could observe to connect the face to a name and a fate, that became less of a guiding force on which characters to focus on, and more of this perceived taunt as I started struggling to cross them off the list. It starts to hit differently when the game kept telling me, oh, by the way, you could theoretically figure this character's deal out by now, just so you know. And as I uncovered more death scenes, I was hearing that core sentiment more often. So, yeah, Return of the Obra Dinn did get the better of me, but in terms of being one huge logic puzzle centered around a multifaceted murder mystery, I think it did a great job. It was a game that I had my eye on for a while, ever since I saw it pop up in a Nintendo Direct, because I could just tell there was something about it that would draw me to it, and I am glad that my gut feeling was right about that. That's the thing about most of the games that I've played. I feel like I've actually had a really good success rate when it comes to choosing ones that I genuinely enjoy playing, or at the very least feeling like it was worth my time to extract something crucial from it and understand and like what they're giving me, even if I don't finish them all on my own. I think most of this comes from the fact that I've been pretty selective about which games I look into playing, and I understand my own tastes enough that I know more or less what to look for. And between the previous video and up to this point in this one, you hopefully have a good idea of what I like. It's rare for me to play a game that I don't like, though there are a couple in my Steam library that I've sort of shoved out of sight forever. This next game is not quite at that level, but I still didn't really like it, and I feel bad because it was gifted to me by one of my best friends, because they had fun with it, and I don't want anyone to feel like I don't appreciate their gifting something to me, or that I don't appreciate their own tastes in games that they're trying to share about themselves. But at the end of the day, I'll be honest with what I think, and when it comes to the game Figment, it's just not one for me. It's got puzzles, the characters are cute, the art style is well developed. I can appreciate all these things in a vacuum along with how it fits into what my friend likes. Look, it's got a bird. Birds are really cool. The issue is every time it talks, I want to throw it into the sun. But if you like birds and you like what you see in this trailer, maybe you'll enjoy this game. Good bird game. Good bird game. I hope the people who will enjoy a more laid-back cutesy puzzle experience will find this game and have fun with it, but it's not for me. I didn't even finish it, and I fought against the urge of the sunk cost on this one to pick it back up and see through it to the end. But it's just not going to happen. But hey, maybe it'll happen for you. And if you're my friend who gifted this to me and you're watching this, just please know you're still valid. I love you. This doesn't say anything about us. Hooray. Let's move on. I also got around to playing Ori and the Blind Forest like I hoped that I would at the end of my part 1 video. This game kicked my ass. Sheesh, but in a good way. I died just so many times. My little Ori guy was just put through the ringer time and time again as I figured out how to get through each platforming gauntlet. That being said, considering how many Ori lives I spent to finish this game, it never felt tedious, and the combos of moves that I needed to do in some especially tricky sections were pretty fun to put together. The big issue was that I just needed to get good. Simple as, and that was no small task, especially considering that it felt like there were more buttons on the keyboard that I needed to keep track of than I had fingers to hit them with at times. I suppose I could criticize the game for that, the fact that I was actually getting a workout in my hands by playing this game when that's not something you really expect to happen. Well, at least I don't expect it to happen. But I also knew that I'm really averse to managing a lot of things in the games that I play, especially when it comes to combat, inventory, skill trees, all of that fun stuff. You should have seen me play Breath of the Wild at my friend's house this one time. I could not keep track of all my weapons and items at all, and I was running around looking like a complete idiot. It was very stupid, but it was very funny. That's just something I think I need to get used to, and games like Ori and Animal Well also had a good moderate helping of that sort of thing to make the experiences of my first 2 Metroidvanias challenging, but fun ones. I think half my deaths just came from pressing the wrong button when I thought it was the right one. That's on me. I was happy to accept that. It was a good workout. The only other thing that I have to say about Ori is a note regarding its story. This is just completely random, but I thought it was a bit strange that the central conflict in the story involves Ori and beings of light fighting against the giant owl that's associated with the darkness. That battle between light and darkness is not the part that I find interesting. That's a tale as old as time. The interesting part was that it called attention to how the owls die if they're exposed to the light, so they thrive in the darkness, which again is not anything particularly noteworthy, except that they go out of their way to show how the mother owl has been trying, for all intents and purposes, to be a good mother to her babies, which were almost all wiped out by the wave of light that swept over their nest before the story begins. It made me question what the game's narrative was trying to tell me by leading me to conclude that the darkness negatively affects the light and the light negatively affects the darkness, but both sides have actors that are just trying to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. So you think there would be some common ground that could be set up there, and I guess that's what the ending of the game starts to set up when Ori rescues and looks after the last baby owl. But it's still a bit weird to have the setup be that each side so inherently hurts the other that it is implied that one side eventually has to wipe out the other or otherwise have a commanding dominion over the land. I don't know if that's the message that was intended for us to take from it, and it's kind of hard to have that story where you try to peacefully resolve tensions between the light and the dark when the very dichotomy of light and dark is almost universally understood to be one where the light is good and the dark is bad. So what does that mean for Ori's world after the Mama Owl dies? Is it just not supposed to ever have too much light in it anymore because they're presumably going to try to raise the last owl so that it can grow up? The light wiped out its brothers and sisters, after all, who weren't even born, so it's not like they could be associated with any negative morality or any morality at all. So I just thought it was strange. That's not really affecting my perceptions of Ori overall, so it's not something I feel like I really need to focus on. It was yet again another solid experience. I'm really happy that I played it. I think my fingers have finally recovered from the dancing that they were doing on the keyboard while I played. Now I'm going to talk about Talos Principle II. This is the second time on the channel that I'm going to describe what it was like enjoying a piece of media, speculating about what it would look like if that piece of media was ever revisited, but not seriously hoping for it, and then actually being surprised when it did happen. The other time was for an electronic music album, but this time it's a game sequel. I didn't expect Crow Team to make the Talos Principle II. Just didn't expect it. I did think in my mind it would be cool if they did, see how much further they could explore making puzzles out of the tools we're given in the first game, give us new environments, centered maybe around completely new religions and cultures and exposing us to completely different philosophies and ways of seeing the world. The architecture of the first game had already permanently colored how I see the built environment around me, to the point where I can go onto most college campuses or town squares or even just the garden grounds of a big building and start to think, oh, where would the lasers be directed here? But also, this Tetris effect applies to large buildings dedicated to a certain cultural construct, thinking about how they could possibly be a hub world for a brand new batch of puzzles. As an example, I traveled out west to the state of Montana in 2018, and walking around the East Glacier Lodge had me imagine what the Talos Principle might look like from the perspective of some of the Native American populations. And I unfortunately haven't gone far enough east in my travels yet to be inside buildings for the other huge religions in the world, but just picture what a set of levels in an Islamic context would look like, or one in a Hindu context, or a Buddhist one, or anything else. I always wondered whether a future Talos Principle II would look like that, even though I figured no one had plans to make it. But they made it, and the new areas we explore are unfortunately not anything of what I just described. But unlike the Solar Fields album that I reviewed, I was not disappointed with what they gave us. The Talos Principle II world has a semi-unified style of advanced brutalist and modern architecture with some local variation, which is slightly disappointing because it doesn't match up with what I had hoped for, but that's okay because this game is still extremely fun to explore. This time we're now exploring 4 sections of the wilderness far away from the rebuilt contained city full of androids that slowly grew in numbers after the events of the first game. And like all the real good games do, the 4 areas reveal themselves to us in the order of the classical elements. You got the island with the grass and the trees and stuff for earth, the snow area for water, the desert area for fire, and finally the last area, which is about air. Like it's there's air there. They made it work. I always find it funny how that trope of using those 4 elements has still persisted throughout the years, and I never get tired of it. Here is to many more games doing the same thing in the future. All the best games do it. I think the places that we explore in this game are amazing, even bigger and grander than the places in the first game, which already was not afraid to indulge itself in its themes of exploration, questioning what the purpose of humanity is, all the big brain stuff, and just the colossal structures we see, chief of which is the mother of all Bass Pro Shops that we get to explore as well. I shouldn't make that joke. Apparently only about 20% of you come from the United States. Whatever. Anyway, this game was a welcome surprise. The new tools we get are extremely fun to use. Thankfully, I didn't have to use anything that would spike my stress levels like the timed playback tool in the first game, which wasn't terrible. Those puzzles just always felt more consequential to mess up. The story is somehow even more involved and intriguing than the first game, and I think it builds on it in a way that feels complete and appropriate. The philosophical conundrums are even more involved than those in the first game too, which made for some nice treats to think about. Now, even given all of those things that I loved about the game, Talos 2 made me think about something that I think is even more interesting than any of them. This next section is going to be a little bit sort of all over the place, but I want to try to talk about loneliness. Now, there are already several video essays on loneliness in video games. They're all very good. They'll tell you about how games like Minecraft, Hollow Knight, Red Dead Redemption 2, among many other games, force you to reckon with moments where you are completely isolated, how those situations are brought about, and how potent they can be, and why they matter so much to us. You'll have to forgive me for not having reviews or comments on hand to illustrate my point, but people pointed out the same thing about Talos 1. It's a game where you are by yourself in a post-apocalyptic world, with no other humans or humanoids around. The only company you get is this big booming voice from the sky, and the occasional text conversation with an AI on a computer. It's lonely as a result of the obvious nature of the environment and the world. Most of the games that I've talked about between these two videos could also be described as largely lonely. But I don't want to talk about loneliness like that. I want to try to define this other idea of loneliness differently. Because some players of Talos 2 also describe the game as lonely. Again, sorry I don't have specific quotes to share. But this is interesting because in Talos 2, there is an entire city full of humanoid robots walking around that you can interact with. You can talk to a good portion of them, and even when you do inevitably join the expedition with only a select few to check out the rest of the game, you get to talk to them all the time and learn about their personalities in great detail and understand the humanity that they carry. But somehow, I at least found that it still didn't feel like enough. This type of loneliness comes from their feeling like the environment is not doing enough to properly orient you with the expectation of how peopled your surroundings are going to be. I think this is a specific feeling that I, again, haven't really seen anyone on YouTube talk about. Jacob Geller approximated it in his video about naissance, when he highlighted how a public school will feel much more empty than you would expect when you're attending an after-school activity, and there aren't constantly kids in the hall, and now there are many more bathroom stalls that are needed for just the concert happening in the auditorium that night. In that moment, there's a mismatch between the population and the environment's expected population. There just aren't enough people. Alex Shakes also poked at this concept a bit in their video Loneliness in Video Games when they talk about how when you defeat all the enemies in a room in Halo, you're just now surrounded by dead NPCs in an area that's built for you to fight more than 0 living NPCs. But in both of these examples, these are temporary consequences of how the game or real life operates. These environments are, for all intents and purposes, still populated correctly most of the time. With that in mind, let's return to Talos 1. Or let's go back to Soma, or Cairo, or Submachine, or Cyan's newest entry in their catalog, Firmament. All of these games take place in an environment that is decidedly post-humanity, meaning that humanity existed there once, and now they don't. So you might think that this mismatch of what the environment was built for and what we actually see would cause that same feeling of loneliness. But not so fast. Sure, in all of these settings, there's the loneliness of solitude and being the only one left, probably, but we're also armed with the genre of video game that takes place after everyone else has left. It's a genre now. So to me at least, I can explore these environments and not feel lonely like that because I've accepted that my status of being the last one is how the game is trying to make me feel. This is also why upon rewatching Jacob Geller's video on naissance, I can understand feeling the loneliness of being by myself in that game, but I don't think I feel the same feeling of something being wrong in terms of evaluating that there should be more people in this gray labyrinth. I don't necessarily view this environment as one that was built for us, even if it might be built out of similar elements that you would find in most buildings that are built for us. Like Blam and Submachine, these two stories highlight a world that might have started out being built for humans, but they have twisted into something unrecognizable way before we got there, with the only similarity being the visual elements themselves. None of these places are built for us anymore, so we might be lonely, but that's expected. So now let's bring it back all the way to Talos 2. See, I just think Talos 2 is different. Yeah, we know we're going on a trip to a remote place that doesn't house human civilization, so it shouldn't cause any dissonance that we feel isolated when there's only 5 or 6 robots walking around out in these zones. But to me, it still does. It still feels like there should be more of us, or that maybe each space should be a bit smaller. Maybe these individual islands and planes are just a tiny bit too expansive, the space between puzzles just taking a bit too long to traverse. Even though someone built these puzzles out in the wilderness where we have no right to be, it still feels like they were made to accommodate at least a couple more of us. I don't know why I perceive this mismatch to be there. Maybe I'm not able to fully separate it from the themes of the game and the larger reality of there effectively only being 1,000 humans on the entirety of planet Earth now. But I do know that I'm probably not the only one. From what I remember reading other people saying, this type of loneliness snuck up on them. They weren't expecting it, and maybe that's due to the uncanniness being necessarily driven by something more subtle. I start to wonder if something about nailing this mismatch has to do with the planning of each space. Maybe we're onto something when we reference the distance between puzzles. Maybe that's why I get a similar uncanny feeling from shopping malls, even if they're full of people. Doesn't this ceiling look built slightly too wide? There's something about it that doesn't match my gut feeling of what it means to build for human proportions. For another example, look at the Librarians video on games made in the Source engine, which tries to describe the creepy feeling that people get from playing them. Look at the map featured, and imagine it full of people. The comments are all pointing out that it's creepy because no one's there, or because there are sounds you hear without objects attached to them, or because the graphics are only quasi-realistic. But try to picture that everyone was there, and the place was bustling like you would expect. Is the uncanny feeling still there? Is there still the possibility that this square is built slightly too out of proportion for natural human movement? What I'm trying to ask is, does GM Construct lack feng shui? I'm not really sure, but I just have this core feeling that this idea of spatial planning might be driving the more technically defined feeling of derived loneliness that I get from playing games like Talos Principle II. I don't have any science or understanding of human psychology to back this up. Broadly, I'm interested in learning more to see if maybe I'm onto something here. The psychology of understanding human space in the built environment. I feel like there's something to be explored there. So that's my long-winded explanation of something in Talos Principle II that's going to stay with me for a long time. And, pretty much everything else the game offers is going to stay with me for a long time too. And I'm just happy that it exists. Again, considering the fact that I didn't think it was going to happen at all, to begin with. Last thing that I'll say about Talos Principle 2, the only negative thing I found about this game was the fact that more modern methods of sampling and interpreting video game graphics made me waste a lot of time tweaking the settings so that the graphics would stop distracting me with a collection of visual bugs that people have realized are pretty standard with newer, fancier technology now. I feel a bit out of my depth here because I don't have the technical terminology to be able to express myself fully on this. I would love to nail down the difference between TAO, DLSS, TSR, and all these other abbreviations that are supposed to be making the gaming experience better, but don't seem to be. I'd love to know how this tech even works at all so that I can know whether or not the gaming industry is doing this to actually make gaming experiences better, or if they're just doing it to cut costs at the experience's expense in order to maximize profit, because that's the economic model that we're continuing to perpetuate and support. I've tried to learn it, but the world is already spinning fast enough as it is, and I can only dedicate so much time to figuring out how exactly any aspect of the things we enjoy are succumbing to the inevitable process of enshittification. And the next game that I'd like to talk about also suffers from this. I mentioned it previously. It's Firmament, the latest IP from Cyan. I also spent more time than I would have liked trying to tweak settings there so that the graphic glitches caused by the new tech would go away. And unfortunately for Firmament, this is not the only time where I ran into something that I thought was more awkward than it had to be in order to serve new technology. There were actually 2 more instances of such a thing happening. The first one is much more subtle and not really that serious. While I was playing the game, in the back of my mind, I was always having this itch that the controls of my special tool that I used to do everything were a bit strange, but besides realizing that I could do some actions 2 different ways, didn't really have much reason to question what was happening there. Maybe it's just a new experimental mechanic that looks to push games forward, like an Exo One. Turns out the controls are that way so that the game can be more smoothly translated to VR. Now, in the face of this age of tech development we're living in, I haven't seen much of anyone take a hard stance against VR. I also won't be doing that. But that being said, I've always thought that the potential for virtual reality technology has always been limited by physical realities that are always going to prevent the gap between what we'd like to experience in our mind's eye and what is actually feasible from ever being completely closed. I don't think we're actually ever going to get Ready Player One. So I see this tweak to the nicer controls that I might have otherwise had if it was solely developed for a desktop and console as something to question a bit. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge issue at all. It didn't slow down my gameplay that much, so no harm, no foul. And I don't hate VR. Most of the time I'm thinking about it is after I watch a video from like Knowledge Husk. It's casual and it's passing. But what's not casual and definitely not passing is the second bigger issue. I managed to go almost the whole game, as I had for basically every other game that I've played before this, without ever having to question whether any of the art assets were made with the assistance of AI technology. But then at the end of the game, there just had to be portraits of people hanging on a wall. And considering that we've all been imbued now to look out for like the AI look that AI images still have, I could not help but see the portraits and actively wonder if AI was involved. And yep, suspicions were confirmed. They were AI generated. Or, my mistake, sorry. They were AI-assisted drawings along with basically all of the text lore and anything else that resembles the most classically artistic bits of this game. I don't know what AI-assisted means, if that means that they got the same image from an AI generator and then traced over them so that technically what made it into the game was physically made with human hands. That could be one definition. I don't really know much about Cyan as a studio. The idea that I have is even if they have some really popular games that are household names like Myst, they're still a small indie studio. Maybe they felt the squeeze of not being a AAA game company and needed to save on some labor costs, so they turned to AI. I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much. It just makes me uncomfortable about the actions people take when making a game in this economy when they resort to machine learning techniques like this. I'm not going to start a spiel on AI right now because this video is long enough as is, and we still have 2 games left to go. But it really marred the experience of Firmament for me when I otherwise could have had a game that I remembered solely for its beautiful environments and intriguing, if maybe a bit simplistic, puzzles. It's really too bad, and I wish for things to be different in the future. So I feel like I now need a bit of a palate cleanser, which means I now get to talk about Sable. Sable is wonderful because it is an open world game that I ended up enjoying a lot, whereas previously I always had the sneaking suspicion that I would never be able to enjoy an open world game. There was just nothing about the concept that really attracted me to them. But Sable did. If Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild frustrated me, then Sable is that Breath of the Wild experience that I was looking for the entire time. I knew I wanted to play this game after I finished the demo for it because the idea of traversing a wide open desert on a land speeder to discover huge monuments and ruins of ancient mysteries while being also able to explore communities of other travelers, I knew it was going to be a fun and relaxing time, not to mention the art style and color palette that everything is painted in. It reminded me again of several trips that I've taken out west in the US, not just Montana as previously mentioned, but also to New Mexico and now to Arizona, where I wrote a good portion of this video's script. It's fun to just explore, and the fact that the story is not centered around a conflict of some sort where the good guys have to defeat the bad guys is a welcome breath of fresh air. This is a story instead of a young girl on a coming-of-age journey where you have to explore the desert and live life a bit by figuring out which mask you want to adorn yourself with before you return to your clan in the place that you started. Each mask speaks to different qualities that you might choose to identify yourself with that you discover about yourself in your travels. You can come and go from communities as you please without the pressures of regular day-to-day life. You can climb up sheer rock faces. You can float around using a special power-up that you find early on. And you can even go fishing right in the desert sand itself. It's a top-tier fishing minigame in Sable. Again, this game is a wonderful breath of fresh air. I did notice that at times the controls were a bit janky. The entire game world itself can be said to have this sort of jank feeling that I associate not so fast. I associate this with games lovingly made by creators that really put their heart and soul into it, so that just made me appreciate what I was playing even more. Sable sat in my Steam wishlist for a very long time compared to other games that I've played, and it became a bit of a personal meme for me whenever I saw it go on sale, because for the longest time, I just, for whatever reason, did not think it was the right time for me to just jump in and play it, but eventually after like 9 or 10 different times it went on sale, I took the plunge, and I was very glad that I did. If you haven't played Sable yet and are looking for a complete change of pace, I cannot recommend it enough. It's just really nice. So now, we're finally here at the main event for this video. I'd now like to finally talk about Submachine Legacy. If you're a regular audience member of mine, hopefully you did not skip past too many of the other games that I talked about and came straight here. I did put a good bit of effort into what I wanted to say for each one, so go back, watch a couple more. There are some good games out there. You're not going to hear me talk about these games again, so, take the chance while you have. But either way, at long last we're here. It's interesting because I still don't know how to accurately preface any time that I start talking about Submachine on this channel. Talking about the Submachine games is how I've gotten any sort of consistent audience. No one else on this website, as far as I know, has reliably talked about these games like I have. And yet, it is a game series that I think has constantly flown under the radar of the general public since 2005, even if people do vaguely remember playing it on the Flash game websites back in the day. Note to self, put some images of the game on the screen right now to try to shake loose some distant memories of anyone who might be watching. So, the question is, who am I addressing here? Am I addressing the fans in the Submachine community that I know have been waiting for over a year for me to talk about it? Or at least I think some of them still are here. Am I looking to cater to just anyone on YouTube who might have stumbled across this video and is still watching? Which, thank you very much, by the way, if you still are. I'm trying to persuade you to play this game series that started 20 years ago. Am I trying just to be educational for the aliens that will salvage this video's corrupted MP4 file from the YouTube servers 1,000 years into the future? Or 20 years into the future? I don't know how to best answer this question, which sucks because I do want to talk about Submachine Legacy properly in depth, and I originally was going to have this be a separate video where I can indulge myself in the finest level of detail I could imagine over hours and hours, because this has been my favorite game series for over a decade by this point, ever since I jumped on board, and it has been so formative for me in many different ways. But unfortunately, time constraints are preventing me from doing that. The world, as I said before, is spinning faster and faster, so I'll have to do my best to condense my thoughts in this already pretty long video instead. And I still don't really know the best way to start. I should probably start with a disclaimer and short history that will also provide a good bit of background for those not in the know. Let's just step back and see how far we've come. Submachine is a series of small point-and-click room escape games that take the player on a sci-fi journey through a broken world where machines have built their own environments and structures far beyond human control. Your job is to pick through these structures and find some way of escaping, and you do this by following in the footsteps of several people who were here before you, and have also explored or directly contributed to the degradation of this bizarre universe of indeterminate location, size, and dimensionality. There are 10 games in the main series, along with 4 side games that were released between 2005 and 2015, 2017 if you count expansion updates. And there's also now a card game that released this year. I got in on Submachine properly around 2012 or 2013, quickly realizing that this was a hyperfixation that would dominate all my others. I could not get enough of this world. Fan art, fan fiction, theories about what the big overarching story was really all about. Editing the Submachine wiki so thoroughly that I eventually was poised to administrate the whole thing, and importantly, spending time writing thousands of posts on the fan forum for all of developer Mateusz Skutnik's works. Between all of these things, it's safe to say that I immediately filled the community with my presence, and I filled my free time in turn with this game that I simply wanted to be immersed in forever. It's a community that occupies its own small corner of the internet too, which means that the number of active fans was never that big, but it did mean that we were passionate. We created our own satellite lores and stories for the community itself, And Mateusz Skutnik, at the center of his own little world, did everything that he could to nurture this continuing story and hype of this perpetual party for this wonderful game series full of places to explore and items to use and beautifully digitally drawn architecture to gawk at and deliciously cosmic horror to ponder as well. He brought this perpetual mystique to all of it, being simultaneously extremely accessible as another member in the community that chatted with us about whatever, but also withdrawing into this vaguer persona as the architect of the mysterious world, who may or may not hold the answers to all of the questions we still had. And it clearly was a huge deal when people were so interested in his work that they were starting to use their new YouTube channel to do Let's Plays of his games, or taking inspiration from channels like Markiplier or the Game Theorists to start making Submachine theories in video form, or putting on even the Tyler McVicker hat and just generating media tracking what he was doing. I was doing all of these things because Submachine was just that interesting to me, and as a result of Skutnik appreciating how much I was giving his work prominence, we had this special sort of pen-pal connection form. I'm not saying this to sound parasocial for no reason. We both want to meet up with each other, which has been difficult to do when he's in Poland and I'm in the United States, but we chat every so often. He has sent me Polish chocolates before. I feel like I need to disclose this before I offer my thoughts on Submachine Legacy. Not just so that people know that I have a bias, but so people fully understand bias. People need to fully understand what it's like to so completely take the time to understand what an artist has been trying to tell us as a storyteller in their work. It is a conversation that I've poked at a couple times in this video already when I talked about walkthroughs, but really this is a form of communication that is always happening when a developer makes an indie game that they are passionate about and people engage with it to different degrees of immersion. So understand that I'm not just giving this game a review. I am talking about a story that is deeply part of a conversation that I and others have been having for years. This is a game coming from a community where I've been able to freely talk with people from other countries, which eventually turned into regular Discord calls, and even in some cases led to spending time with them in real life, and genuine friendships and connections that lasted for years. This is a piece of culture that I hope to share with all of the new friends that I make. A game that I want to watch all of them experience because it's that core to me. It's all tied together by Submachine. And let's talk about Submachine, before Submachine Legacy came along. For all the videos that I've made, including the ones that I've deleted and including some of the ones that I've re-uploaded, I've never really tackled talking about Submachine head-on and what I just generally think about it. I've gotten close. I made a video where I was frustrated that the story was never fully coming together. That was the closest I ever got to looking at the series as a whole. It's a series of games where each installment provides some answers and introduces even more questions. We know that we're exploring an environment originally built by human design, but how big is it? Are we above or below ground? Are we in space? Are we in some other sort of virtual mathematical construction? Are we inside or outside? What is inside the core of the subnet? Where is the outside of the subnet? Why is everything lit up with bright lights if we're surrounded by pitch black void? Where is the light coming from? How does physics work here? Why are some things floating? Where is everyone? What does it mean for people to disappear into different layers of reality? What was the subnet originally built for? Who built it? Is the subnet apart from the rest of Earth, or has it subsumed part of it? Are we even still on planet Earth at all? What really distinguishes green karma energy from blue karma energy? It has been simultaneously extremely intriguing and incredibly frustrating at times to secure answers to all of these questions. A lot of them can be answered with reasonable certainty if you take the time to play through the games enough, and have reasoned discussions with other fans, or ask Mateusz himself for clarifying questions. Sometimes he will spill his secrets. We've been trying to put all the puzzle pieces in place for the longest time, adding to a puzzle that seems to always expand its borders. We are trying to solve the world being given to us.
Now, this theorizing thing, though, really only works if there's actually a deeper story to be told, and if the story and game world itself don't have internal contradictions. It would be a lot harder to learn about our universe if the laws of physics and space-time that seem to govern it could be broken. The same applies to movies, too, which also make up a big part of media critique culture, just like games do. And when you have a piece of media that purposefully hides its inner workings from the audience, it's harder to tell if there actually is a cohesive story to find underneath all of the layers and obscurity that some games have.
For the longest time, Submachine has existed as two gaming experiences. First, the game that's concerned with picking up the items and solving the puzzles to slowly make your way to the exit. And second, the meta game of building the complete picture of the world that Mateusz Skutnik has painted bit by bit for us. We look to understand as much as possible from it, and he's fostered this himself by giving us an entire game in the series, Submachine Universe, that exists to showcase how real-world people have written down their attempts to answer these many questions throughout the years, myself included. And some of us take the time to determine whether or not we accept or reject its form based on what we know. In the past, I adopted the framework that said, if all of these details don't point to a fully complete and logical picture with zero contradictions or plot holes, then this game is at fault for that, and I choose to evaluate it based on that. I don't do that anymore. I don't have all the answers figured out yet, partially because my experience with Submachine has already shifted many times between feeling like I have a solid grasp on it and feeling like I don't really know anything at the end of the day. Common experience if you talk to another Submachine fan. Sometimes it's difficult to conceptualize what this world's form actually looks like and what exactly happened when. Sometimes it's easier to accept it just as the story of a man who became caught up too much in his own passions of science and exploration and became secluded from everyone else, and his actions caused ripple effects and catastrophes that he couldn't fully understand until those who knew him best opened his eyes and allowed him to reconnect with the rest of us and rebuild for a better future. That's basically the plot if you boil it down enough. It feels like even if we know all of these fine details of the world and the events that transpired, it's really difficult to put them all together in a good summary, which is why people keep asking for resources on a summary of Submachine's story and why it's been difficult to make one after all this time. Not for lack of trying. What it seems I learned most from exploring the story of Submachine is not how necessarily good or consistent the story is, which is not to say that the story is not those things, but that the greatest value to be extracted is that of the story being told in the first place and the effects that it has had on us. I think that probably sounds like a cop-out to a lot of people. Of course, we want a good story that's built out of more than just the friends we made along the way. We'd like to hope that a story told by someone who really holds up his storytelling ability as what makes him who he is satisfying in ways that go just beyond the satisfaction of having something to be entertained by. To fully talk about this more might mean that I'll be seeing you in the comments, but what I can say is that throughout all of the theories, questions and answers, and mysteries, it has really been a wonderful story about discovery, about feeling alone in the face of a world that doesn't make any sense, about the duality of both stress and intense interests of dealing with the unknown, and about what it means to create something and lose your grasp on it, and being conscious about the effect that it has on others. There's more to it than that, but simply put, we cannot deny that there is something there that's worth holding on to, and I do not believe that those messages are impeded by any logical inconsistencies or holes that might present themselves. So that's generally the story part, and I think I also have to speak to or pitch the setting and the gameplay of Submachine as well. Let's talk about the setting first. This is a game that I think originally got so popular because people could tell that Skutnik had plans to take the Flash platform and bend it to his will so that he could create some of the coolest looking adventure games out there. It took a few games for the Submachine aesthetic to be established. I wasn't there for it in 2005, but I don't think anyone was necessarily fawning over these graphics from the original Submachine 1. But it definitely did get established. Submachine 2 helped a lot, and it's extremely interesting to see how his interests in designing different parts of the subnet had shifted over time. The earlier games are very focused on the basic architecture of places reminiscent of what we know, meaning Western residential dwellings or office-based structures or assorted public utility buildings, a basement with wood panel walls, a lighthouse, a laboratory, lots of electromechanical objects to play with. A lot of stuff of industry, things that are reminiscent of humans finding their footing in a built-up industrial society. And as the games go on and the story gets more cerebral and focused on higher orders of philosophy, the environments get less mechanical and more spiritually informed, discovering places of worship from other cultures, religious iconography, and an increasing obsession with the spatially and geometrically divine. As Skutnik's drawn screens become more complex, he clearly is bending Flash 2 as well, as I said, but also the platform itself still offers a slightly constricting guidance where all of these things feel still somewhat primordial and raw. The line art and simpler polygons that form the root of this style are always there. And Mateusz is a student of architecture, and you can see a passion for it everywhere in how he forces you to explore every nook and cranny of these environments, forcing you to just like rub your nose in the paneling and the bricks and the mortar and the stone everywhere you click. Whether it's in the more functional environments or the ones that are built to commemorate the top excesses of human ingenuity, you will enjoy bricks and mortar when you get out of here. You will never look at it the same way again. But his architectural background doesn't mean that he's building, the subnet is building, all of these areas to specifications with engineering precision, interestingly enough, as if it's concerned with how real-world people are fitting into all these places. First of all, notice how the screen is taking place in a 1-to-1 aspect ratio. That is incredibly tight, but the point is you have to focus on everything in the room at once, because these games have you click from room to room instead of the traditional turning to face one wall at a time like you would in other room escape games. We're going places in this world, my friend. We're not just staying in one spot. And this means that you're seeing everything at once, so you see the walls, the floor, and the ceiling in foreshortened proportions, and the items within do not stick to their real-world proportional sizes. This allowed things to pop better in a screen space that was originally only 300 pixels squared. But it also contributes to this existential feeling that this place is not exactly built for us anymore, and we have lost our grip on all of the things that we have created throughout the centuries. So now we either have to figure out how to fix all of that, or just escape and leave it all behind. It's a wonderful aesthetic that is fun to see expanded on game after game, because each game brings in new objects from new places and new time periods. The subnet really does work to try to envelop everything about what we as humans have built, what we as humans can create that situates us properly in the real world. And I think it's just really neat to see someone go all in on an appreciation for the built form in that sense. And then there are the puzzles. The three main aspects of Submachine, its puzzles, the built environment, and the stories contained within, not very easy to separate from each other, but the puzzles themselves are perhaps the easiest to tease out because they largely are the least special out of the three. That's not to say they're bad by any means, in fact, and I do try to say this without 13 years of gameplay permanently altering my brain. The puzzles, for the most part, are pretty fair, I think, requiring no huge leaps of logic or trial and error to solve, just maybe a bit of patience, maybe a bit of classical pixel hunting, just pay attention where your mouse is going. That being said, the puzzle solving you'll be doing in Submachine is pretty ordinary because the overwhelming majority of the puzzles take the form of finding an item and figuring out where to put that item to access another area or another item. And the puzzle comes from being able to observe the environment and figure out where each item is supposed to go. There are some classical room escape game puzzles to be found, and some of the games switch it up and force you to treat the entire installment like a huge puzzle box where you have to look at the game as a whole to really figure out what's going on. But largely it's a situation where you find an item and figure out where it's supposed to go by paying attention to the design of the item and the world around you. Simple key and lock setup. What makes Submachine and also other games by Mateusz unique is how committed it is to this mechanic. By the time you get to Submachine 10, there are so many items that you're picking up and inserting into other things that you should have long ago started asking the question, why are all of these items just scattered around the world like this in the first place? And how convenient is it that you're able to get all the ones that you need? Which places Submachine in a very interesting spot on the previously mentioned spectrum of how much this world is built for you specifically to solve compared to games like Cocoon or Creaks, especially once you start adding what the lore has to say about the exploration teams that were here before you and were doing pretty much the same puzzles you were doing as an explicit test of their abilities. This sort of puzzle is not exactly complex, which means that it could be quite a turnoff for anyone who decides they're not invested in this repeated interplay between the puzzles and the world of Subnet. It's a marathon of the same type of puzzle mechanic, and I do wonder if that makes it one of the main contributing factors as to why Submachine never got really popular. I mean, by the time you get to Submachine 10, you're given a whole backpack to expand your inventory space. Over the course of Submachine 10, when I first played it, just like in the rest of the games, when I learned how focused the gameplay was on this one specific mechanic, and how the motions became so distilled and centering on getting items, open up new areas, more items, it actually did make me wonder if the entire Submachine experience now was being simplified too much, just giving the barest bones possible of this puzzle setup. This was a great thing to have properly visualized for us when a community member showed us how the Submachine puzzles could be mapped onto dungeon graphs, a concept formed by Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit. The whole experience becomes very mechanical, and I think if these items and their respective locks were not so intimately married with the environments they were found in, they might come across as just this sort of BS mechanic that you have to deal with in order to see the next cool thing or learn the next piece of information. And of course, we also can't forget the experience of what it's like to miss an item somewhere in the labyrinth of rooms, which means that eventually your progression will come to a halt, and then you'll have to start backtracking for the thing you missed, and that's when the real frustration will start to set in. Because of course, that's the nature of these puzzle games. Every item has only one, maybe sometimes two uses, and everything that needs to be done in turn can only be done by one special thing. No one that I know of is designing point-and-click room escape games that allow players to be resourceful and creative without bound and come up with multiple solutions or item usages when it comes to figuring out how to progress past something in our way. And Submachine is definitely no exception. If you don't have the thing you need to progress, Submachine offers no help on where to look, not even a hint. That's when you are most reminded that these beautiful and intriguing rooms you've been exploring, the hundreds of them, are still not there to ease you along. It's a cold and unforgiving world out there in the subnet. Submachine 10 The Exit provides the pinnacle of this feeling in the main series, but Submachine Universe, the side game, really pushes this concept to its limit. See, Submachine Universe also has a lot of items and puzzles that you have to keep track of, but they're also spread out over 120 different locations, each of which has a unique 3-number code that you have to remember if you want to go back there. Or alternatively, these locations can only be reached from one of those 3-number coded locations by a portal, so you have to remember what location those portal accessed locations are tied to, and what is in each location that you might be able to interact with. Of course, this teleporter allows you to put in any 3 numbers you want, but not all of the combinations will send you somewhere. From the way I'm describing it, this sounds impossible to keep track of, and if you don't have a pen and paper, it very well might be. I've completed Submachine Universe probably upwards of 10 or 15 times in full, and each successive run does not make it that much easier. And I still, every so often, will be doing a run and collecting items and clues to figure out where I have to go next, and I'll be 90% of the way to the end when suddenly I can't use anything in my inventory anymore. And all the partial clues and equations I've assembled on my piece of paper don't give me any more 3-number location codes to try, and I have no idea what I missed, and I have to reluctantly turn back towards the 100 or so locations I've explored for the past few hours and figure out where to backtrack first. It's brutal. It's actually sadistic. And that's the point. No hard feelings of this description of Submachine Universe makes you want to run far away from it, but you have to understand that through this puzzle experience, you get the absolute best sense of how expansive this fictional universe really is. Submachine promises you a hugely expansive world full of weird places to explore, laid out in a fashion that makes it seem like a completely unrestrained growth with almost no rhyme or reason, where it's very easy to get lost immediately, and this demonstrates it perfectly. And Mateusz clearly enjoys this overcommitment to the item and lock mechanic, because this core puzzle designing method is also featured heavily in his first game on Steam, Slice of Sea. And there, the items that you need were also joined by plenty of items that you could pick up that had no use to help you progress. They're just trivial, so be glad that you're not at least dealing with that. But still, all that being said, I'm gonna say this too. The puzzles you have to solve in Submachine Universe are kind of bullshit. You have to crawl every part of the screen to make sure you find absolutely everything. You have to seek 3-number combinations everywhere, whether shown simply on plates or distorted with other characters in between, or encoded in Roman numerals. Hopefully you know those. Or you have to start adding them and subtracting them from other numbers you find. They're hidden in notes, they're hidden in math equations, they're hidden in shapes everywhere. Some of them you have to assemble number by paying attention to colored plates spread across 3 different locations. You will have to mouse over some parts of the environment that don't look like they can be interacted with. You will feel forced to treat everything as though it can be potentially a clue to help you move forward. And technically speaking, almost none of the things you need to do require leaps in logic, so they're not technically bullshit. But with the weight of everything you have to keep track of and double check, there still is a very high chance that something as seemingly innocent as the letter C will make you shut the entire game down and never touch it again. It tests the limits of human patience and mental fortitude. It's insane. And for that reason, Submachine Universe is my favorite game in the Submachine series. Every so often I ask myself what my favorite Submachine game is, and it's always difficult to choose because I love all of them so much, even Ancient Adventure. But thematically, Submachine Universe is in a lot of ways the most Submachine-like of them all. There really is no gaming experience like it in the rest of the series, and I don't think there's a gaming experience like it in all of video games. So yeah, that about does it for describing the puzzles in Submachine, and keep in mind, they're not all like Submachine Universe, that one's just a special extreme example. I just felt the need to highlight it because in many ways that game is the crown jewel in the entire collection. So the puzzles join the story and the environment in this basic three-part analysis of Submachine, and the bulk of why I think this is worth checking out. But there is a fourth part that is going to be pretty relevant when we move on soon, I swear, to Submachine Legacy. I also have to talk about how Mateusz Skutnik has used Submachine to record his own creative process, and more specifically, has made his process of creating Submachine part of the Submachine world itself. We got a sneak peek of this when I talked about how Mateusz would simultaneously serve as just another community member in a lot of respects, but he also would adopt the persona hiding behind the letter M in his posts, just as one of the game characters does when fans speculate about what might be happening in the Submachine games. He takes a lot of chances that he can get to incorporate changes in his creative process for Submachine into Submachine itself. We can actually go right back to Submachine Universe for some notable examples. Late in the game's development, after it was pointed out that a couple locations had their coordinates hinted at in two separate places, rather than removing the second clue completely, Mateusz simply took the text of the clue away from the plate that they were found on, but he left the plate in its spot, and there's a new message that's now found there reading, unreadable, query, unrecognized language. Location 291 is another noteworthy instance. When Submachine Universe first released in 2010, it was only 50 locations large in size, only, with other locations being added over the next 7 years. 291 was one of the original 50, and it ended up being reused in Submachine 7 The Core, which was released 6 months later. After Sub 7 was released, the version of the location in Submachine Universe was updated to show signs of the alterations that were made in Submachine 7. What this did was essentially make Submachine Universe suddenly exist in multiple periods of time, which sort of suggests this alignment with our own timeline. This sense of a new time dimension developing was also supported by almost every new location accessed by Karma Portal in Submachine Universe. It could have been one thing to just add Karma Portals as another thing to interact with, but most of the new Karma Portals fracture their surroundings, which implies different things for the time that Subverse exists in, given what we know about the whereabouts of the person most likely to have been drawing said Karma Portals when these new locations were added, especially after the conclusion of the main series in 2015. There are other examples of this process being carried out mostly in Submachine Universe, but every so often in changes made to the main games as well, and I'll put them on the screen here if you'd like to pause and read about them. But there's a much bigger example, one actually as big as an entire game in the series itself. In 2014, the spin-off game Submachine Future Loop Foundation was remastered, taking what was previously a small side project developed in part to promote some of the music for the real-world music project Future Loop Foundation, and removing all references to anything not created by Mateusz Skutnik, as well as adding new puzzles, drawing nicer looking graphics, and rebranding simply to Submachine FLF. No in-universe explanation is given for why the game is called FLF, so that just sticks around. Plus, Mateusz decided to promote the game as a fifth layer version of what happened in the original, borrowing a piece of world building introduced in Submachine 8. The ending message of FLF now lightly teases the upcoming Submachine 10 at the time, where previously it teased the upcoming Submachine 5 at the time. So again, there's some weird, temporal conceptual stuff being created here, simply as a result of Mateusz wanting the development of the project to be folded right back into the project. So that's the big stuff that I want you to take from Submachine. Big concepts, themes, happenings that kept me coming back year after year. And at the end of it, all I have to say personally is that the conjunction of all these things really just spoke to me and inspired me. It spoke to my developing appreciation for architecture, peering into some of the deepest science fiction concepts I had read about at the time, gave me the opportunity to flex my creative muscles, exposed me to some really cool geometry-based art, and also provided a community of people to share a special niche interest with. I can't really praise the community enough, who was with me as we anticipated the release of new chapters in the series, put together fun forum games to play, bared all the ups and downs of being a small community in a remote place on the internet where everyone knows each other. We got sick of each other every so often, as you do. But it was a great place for belonging, especially as someone who didn't fit in with others either socially or mentally. Looking back on it now, it really was a textbook imagining of having some of my friends in the computer, and I got to either call or meet them in person, the ones that I grew closest to, and I'm really thankful for it. Submachine has given me a lot, and even if the momentum of that community eventually died down over time, people around the world were still eagerly waiting for what a full remaster of Submachine would bring. Even though Slice of Sea was released 2 years earlier, meaning that Mateusz Skutnik had already broken through from being known as a game developer that just worked on Flash games and individual EXEs to a bona fide indie developer on Steam, we were still waiting to see this series properly come alive in full HD quality, unfettered by Flash's technical limitations, incorporating all of Mateusz's signature graphical and interactive elements, and of course, new places to explore in the subnet, as promised. So with that short introduction to Submachine out of the way, what do I think about Submachine Legacy? What's different? What do I like? What do I dislike? The full list of changes I noted down and had thoughts about would not fit inside this entire YouTube channel, and maybe I'll make that list available at some point down the road if you'd like to read absolutely everything, more or less. This will be a condensed version of all of that. Let's start at the beginning. Right from the very first screen, we have a lot to talk about. I'll be honest, I originally had mixed feelings about seeing this full-screen entrance to Submachine for the first time after so many years. The original game set up this narrative of you as a player becoming not just a player of video games, but the player, as you were immersed in the first game, escaping it in that classic room escape fashion only to find that the journey has just begun. It was a potent storyline that has all basically been wiped away because now we have these beautiful hand-drawn entrance shots, making it very clear that we know exactly where the subnet is. Underground in the desert, seemingly from beginning to end. And it seems like we're already knowingly participating in an expedition, maybe scientific in nature, or maybe spiritual. This is really disorienting. The mysterious world from yesterdecade is now much more grounded and a lot less mysterious. I was just expecting it to start more or less as the original started, maybe even in a small size close to the original 300 pixel square measurement before opening up to the promised near 1080p full size when walking down the hallway into Chapter 2. Just a little bit headcanon. I feel bad that new Submachine players won't experience that same immersion in the way that I and others did. And it changes even more. When we exit Chapter 1, we immediately spill out into the behind-the-scenes area that was only revealed to us in Submachine 10. We no longer venture forth directly into the concealed karma portal here. Instead, the new path is off to the left and up a ladder, through which we can now access Chapter 2. I think I'm still recovering from this, to be honest, even though it's been over a year. Everything inside me immediately said, no, this is not right. He screwed up. This is not how it's supposed to be. But of course, I'm still curious as to how this might come back around later, so obviously I'm going to keep playing. Turns out it doesn't really come back around in a special way. This is just how Submachine is now. I mean, technically it does come back around because, we still come back here at the end of Chapter 10, and we see that time has passed and the screen is broken so we can see how we originally got into the lighthouse. Except, wait a minute, that's not the way that we got into the lighthouse anymore, is it? We didn't come out the same way that we came in. And, at this point, at the end of my first playthrough, I didn't really know what to make of that. Let's talk about other world-building things. A second huge change to the world-building comes from being able to now peer into the void. Not only do we now know we're underground, we also can see out the windows and observe these dimly lit dark blue structures and sandbanks and bioluminescent flora in the far distance. There is no longer as huge an air of mystery about where we are because there are so many new waypoints to help us get our footing. Also, locations with notably unique backgrounds that suggested we might actually be back at the surface approaching civilization, or out in some distant nebula elsewhere in the universe, are completely scrapped. The signature void that gives no answers is still present everywhere that's not peering out a window, but the elusive nature of Submachine is quickly becoming resolved. And I'm of two minds as to how I feel about it. Whereas previously Submachine introduced us with so many unknowns that we couldn't even tell whether a location surrounded by void was suspended in the air, or in space, or underground in a cavern with walls so far away that no light could reach them and the sense of being inside or outside doesn't really seem to matter, we can make more reasonable guesses now. I don't really like having the answers. I think I prefer that the unknown stays unknown. When it's unknown, it could be anything. And with a series built so much on fear and intrigue of the unknown, I do wonder if a core thing that made it unique is now being undercut. But that being said, I also think that an argument is to be made that having some sense of bearings on your landscape every so often can actually do more to further the intrigue about the parts that you still cannot see. We can see the ground now, and we can see the defense system stretch into the distance. But we're still underground, keep in mind. How can a cave this big exist under the surface of the Earth? How did it get to be like that? Like, how is it physically possible? What is beyond the hill with the trees, where their weak light runs out? I've thought about this for long enough that I think it's possible to see a better balance between the known and the unknown here, in the same way that an SCP entry would be pretty boring to read if everything was redacted. Like, everything was redacted. In a similar way, this new Submachine world can be even more exciting with the scraps that we have now been given. A third big change to the world building in Submachine Legacy is a seemingly minor point with huge implications, and that is the presence of all 7 layers of reality in every single one of the chapters. Previously, the only chapters where we explored the subnet in 7 different layers were Submachines 8 and 9, possibly 10 as well, though that's a bit unclear. And the sneak peeks that we got into locations from the other games made it clear that there was nothing to be found in other layers. But now, with the late game ability to travel to any chapter in the series and explore it in any layer that you want, which you have to do in order to achieve the true ending, all of the subnet exists now in all of the layers, thereby voiding the special property that made the not what it was. On its face, it might not be a big deal that multiple layers exist everywhere now, because we originally found out in Sub 10 that each main layer is made out of an uncountably infinite number of sublayers, and a new piece of lore added to Legacy says that, yeah, people in the subnet phase into them as soon as they start using portal technology, which is why you never run into anyone else anywhere. But it has huge implications for the properties of karma energy, which makes up the karma portals we see drawn everywhere, and which act as wormholes puncturing through the different layers to transport people. For the longest time, it was more or less assumed that blue karma portals were only present on one layer, and green ones were present in all layers, like what we saw in Submachine 9. But now, all blue karma portals in the entire game are accessible from every layer, because all the layers are everywhere now. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not true. I just thought about that. Some of the secret karma portals are only available in one layer, the ones that you need to access the secret locations in each chapter. So some of the blue karma portals are only existent in one layer, but others are existent in all of them. There's an inconsistency there, isn't there? It's one of those times where, as understanding as I try to be, I did think that this was an example of Mataush making a change that actually broke the game world in a pretty big way. The logic for how these are supposed to work now doesn't really make sense. Now, I'm sure we can have an extended discussion in the comments as to whether the appearance of different types of karma energy relates well with the layers or not, using separate comments Mataush has made about treating different karma portal colors like different bandwidths of karma traffic and all that. But the bigger thing that this change to include all layers in all the games made me realize is that these chapters are starting to be treated less as distinct points in time and more as separate locations to be explored. unless we're to be seen as time travelers ourselves, which would explain how we can jump back and forth between the basement exit shown in one state at the end of Sub 1 versus another state at the end of Sub 10, as previously mentioned. But if we don't assume that, then I'm kind of left with the assumption that visiting these chapters feels more like gathering the information that we need from different stops on a tour of Submachine itself. We'll come back to this. Finally, a fourth big change to the world building comes from the clear influence that Slice of Sea has had on the development of this game. The involvement of the hand-drawn scenery with the blue-shifted Slice of Sea color palette and the brief reference to a scene in Slice of Sea shown in the transition between chapters 8 and 9 make it unmistakable. Mataush is determined to make his properties rub elbows with each other, despite repeated affirmations that Slice of Sea is in the Daymare Town universe, and Submachine is in its own world, and Covert Front is in its own world. It's not really surprising, though, to see Daymare Town and Submachine so intimately close to each other, given that Slice of Sea has references to basically every property that Mataush has had complete creative control over. And I think that game was used as a developing ground for Mataush to really try to perfect his creative style and overall look. Personally, I'm convinced that this shot we see of thresholds and gateways, portals to who knows where, is a sort of worlds between worlds where a transition during a particularly volatile moment of portal transfer allows us to glimpse the potential for many other creative ideas that Mataush has made, or has contemplated making. It allows us to peek behind the curtain. There's strong branding going on here for the aesthetic of Mataush Skutnik, and I appreciate the tie-in, but I also would be lying if I didn't mention that I worry about the aesthetic of Submachine itself being lost a bit in the process. One could easily see Submachine as the most mechanical or technical of Mataush Skutnik's different creative aesthetics. There's no watercolor, no digital brush strokes in the same style as Covert Front, no color scheme and bare-bones minimalism of the classic Daymare Town, no cutesy characters from his smaller games to have to deal with. This is a land of machinery, rudimentary geometry, buildings that stand resolute, and devices of all kinds. Every sound screams of the tangible machine, and the background music is subdued but powerful in delivering this message of physical human creation. But a lot of the new sounds we hear carry this more heightened, active sense of wonder and cues of mindful ponderance and adventure that sound more like they stepped off the altar of Slice of Sea, looking to carry a full conversation with me, instead of, crawling out of the pile of broken metal beams and chair legs of Submachine to ask for their scraps or deliver their message and withdraw promptly. And try as I might, I can't peacefully resolve all of it internally. I don't like playing with the new item pickup and usage sounds, especially after having to hear the former overlap itself time after time if I pick up a bunch of items at once. I'd rather have the old screechy sound of the beam between chapters 4 and 5 back instead of this spiritual beam journey that ends up in lighting up a section, not just lighting up, enlightening up, as if we've approached the highest point of the secluded sacred temple. It's a lab dormitory. Where are all the bells and chimes coming from? It's interesting how much of this shift of aesthetic is driven by the sound design, which I assume Mataush directly collaborated with Thumpmonks on to bring to light. Many of the new pieces of music we hear are really pushing into Slice of Sea territory, with some classic themes like the perfectly callous and mechanically foreboding loop even being directly reinterpreted to fit into this new air of adventure and discovery, something that feels important, something that is a far cry from the simple synths, drones, and mechanical effects that peppered the original game's soundtracks. It really makes me feel like exploring the Lovecraftian horror of the subnet has never been so much fun. It's not Submachine, is it? It doesn't exactly feel like it, right? While we're talking about the slice of sound, Submachine Legacy does not have enough sound effects. Full stop. The sound effects used for all of the item interactions are repeated constantly between different uses. Most power-up moments will use one of two sounds, for example. This is important because one of the things that I really anticipated seeing in each new Submachine game is not just how each installment brought us a unique new environment to explore and new items to use, and sometimes even new puzzle mechanics, but it's all colored by largely unique sounds that you can associate with each game. But now in Submachine Legacy, the sound design has largely been flattened between all of the chapters, so that the sounds package is tied to basically none of them. It's worth noting that Thumpmonks designed all the sounds heard in the game this time because Mateusz was determined to make this game a completely two-person project without having to rely on sounds downloaded from the internet. And I have a feeling that Thumpmonks simply just did not make enough sounds. Maybe Mateusz just thought that what he was given was enough to work with, but I wish there were more. The games don't sound individually special anymore. But to be fair, I don't want to be a complete downer on this point. Most of the new sound effects do fit in one place or another pretty well, even if they're being stretched to fit into 4 or 5 different settings, for objects made of different materials and having different configurations and uses. I actually really like the new sounds for the room transition and the jump cut, probably because they fit exactly into this idea that I have of what a good submachine sound is, informed by machinery and a non-overstated presence. Someone could argue that because they're new, it sucks that the default sound is not the OG ka-thunk, which is arguably the most iconic sound of Submachine, but personally, I am used to the new one. The old one was brash and low quality, and you could argue to the moon and back about how it's really not that big of a deal if the graphics or sound quality are not at their peak for a game to be considered one of someone's greatest of all time, and how so much of the charm can actually come directly from these features, like a lot of people will argue for games like Super Mario 64 or Half-Life. In this case, I think these new sounds fit a new Submachine perfectly. And while we're at it, let's revisit the idea that the ambiences are getting too complex, too open and bombastic, too melodic. This was not Submachine for the longest time. Until Submachine 8 The Plan came out, and then Submachine 9 The Tempo really changed things up with ambience built around chords, and even beats culminating in literal drum beats and music reminiscent of a movie trailer when we descended the giant Shiva statue. People in the community recognized how much of a departure Submachine 9 in particular was from the established Submachine style, both due to the music choices, but also the environment that really broke Submachine into the realm of high mindfulness and discussions of spirituality. Some people didn't like it, but I did. We've come a long way since research teams. We're now dealing with gods and the magical substance of karma directly, and Submachine 10 followed the trend as well, giving us more ornate environments and more complex compositions that seem to be designed to be looked at and appreciated just as much as used. Submachine has always evolved from game to game. With the last few installments in the main series, it just evolved in different ways than we had seen previously. So similarly, there is an argument to be made that this evolution to a style closer to that of the Mateusz overall aesthetic is just the next area that the subnet has expanded to absorb. We'll come back to this, but for now I'll say that the overall idea of this new context for the world building is one that I can get along with. I still wish there were more sound effects though. And visually, most of the graphics are still the Submachine style. They are only changed drastically in the aforementioned view shots or transitions between chapters. The only other significant changes appear in the forms of some extra details drawn in different rooms and devices that need it, and also those mysterious little green lights that are popping up everywhere. We'll talk more about those later as well. Let's move on to talking about changes in the story. Interestingly enough, no big changes have been made to the original story. There have been some additions to the original story that are pretty significant, but the base story itself is relatively untouched. So for the most part, people who are still slaving away at trying to make that perfect Submachine story explained video on YouTube won't have 2 conflicting versions of events to really tell, which I suppose is nice. The largest change to the base story by far is that Murtaugh is now recast as a figure that purposefully went to the waterfall in Kent Falls on a pilgrimage journey instead of being seen as someone who just happened to go camping and stumble on the waterfall and get injured in the catalyst for the entire saga. This is significant because it really wraps up how the Submachine now from beginning to end is all about a planned journey on behalf of Murtaugh, and now us as well, that again harkens to some idea of deliberation and not just somewhere that people found themselves. Murtaugh also has lost his edge a bit in the sense that he was previously characterized as an individual that was sometimes cold and neglectful of his followers and the people that worked under him, and then explicitly revengeful when it came to his invasion of the core. But now he's a bit more gracious in his actions. He tells the defense system that it can rest now when he disables it, and his wording in other sections lends more credence to the idea that he was more misunderstood in his actions rather than being an explicit antagonist. I can't help but notice that this follows a wider trend that Mataush has demonstrated through both Submachine and his development process for the remaster of Daymare Town. He's been careful to remove some of the nastier things you can find in these games. Murtaugh in Submachine is now not as vengeful and cold, a reference to suicide has been removed, and in Daymare Town another grisly suicide is being removed for the remaster, I think, as well as some other disgusting things that I think are actually perfect for capturing this idea that you never know what sort of effed up stuff you're going to be finding in these indie flash games on the internet. But, I guess Mataush wants his worlds to be just a touch more positive, generally speaking. Another change to the base story, is the removal of several of the special messages in the intros and outros of some of these games. Much more prevalent in the early games in the series, these messages address the player directly and hype them up for the game they're playing, or offer short soliloquies from the in-game player about what they're thinking about being caught up in this secret world. The placement of these only really makes sense when you are not playing these games as chapters with one immediately following the other, but instead are waiting anywhere from a few months to a year or two between different games in the series. There's something afforded from simply having a break between chapters to discuss in the community what everyone had just played and what is coming next that adds to the sense of time in the complete journey that is necessarily compressed in Submachine Legacy. Again, this idea of this other sense of a temporal dimension that we should be keeping track of is poking through, and this is reinforced by Shattered Quadrant, the reimagining of Submachine Universe that is also included in Legacy. Years ago, when Mataush was focused on releasing paid HD versions of each individual Flash game, he pondered what would eventually happen to Submachine Universe, and what he would need to do to turn a game so full of other people's contributions into a game that had strictly his own stuff in it. I pointed out at the time that I wondered if and how Mataush would be able to replicate one of my favorite parts of Submachine Universe, which was, as mentioned previously, the real-world wait time of 7 years that it took for the game's scope to grow from 50 locations to 130, via over 40 different updates. As we can see in Legacy, Mataush's final answer to that question was to just include all of the locations from the start, and completely avoid capturing that aspect of the game's experience. So it's lost to time forever. You just had to be there. I realize that these two examples are examples where the sense of marriage of real-world time and Submachine time is not really demonstrated, mostly because the time aspects are being deleted. But the big example in Legacy where this is demonstrated is the multiple new references to the Architect and to the new concept of the shifts. This is where everything properly comes back around, because Legacy is filled with sketches that Mataush made while in architecture school, and it's very clear that Mataush is using the Architect as a sort of stand-in character for himself, with multiple references to how his studies as an architect eventually informed his game design, as well as some of Mataush's own personal musings on the importance of artists being dedicated to their craft, and some of his inspirations for some of the motifs we see in the entire series, like lighthouses and the number 32. It's also worth noting that these discussions about the Architect and the explanations for some of the concepts that we've always wondered about are taking place between two unnamed people that we've presumably been hearing from all the way back in Submachine 8, a master and a disciple, with the former imparting knowledge of the subnet of years or perhaps decades onto this eager mind wanting to learn more. It is so incredibly obvious to me how much Mataush loves this idea of carrying out a story of the perpetual explorer who loves to explore the unknown and interact with systems of vast knowledge, and he has beautifully intertwined this into not just the story of Submachine, but again, the story of the development of Submachine inside the Submachine universe as well. And that just leaves the notion of the new concept of the shift. We see questions about why some items that do not really fit the aesthetic of the game that they're found in having failed to shift away, and this can be explained by the previously demonstrated fact that Mataush is trying to preserve as many of the things that made Submachine special as possible. The shift returns in the historical location 438, which is my favorite since this room was created using one of my Submachine fan arts I designed years ago as a basis. A plate on the wall references the fact that the architect drawing found here is part of the post-Shift 2 era, thereby implying that post-Shift 1 references the storage cabinet that I had originally drawn in this location. And also it suggests a usage further back in the Submachine timeline, or maybe the real-world timeline, as well as a future point in time where the location is non-existent. Maybe this is a recognition that Submachine cannot exist forever because at some point the Steam servers will be shut down and all computers will return to dust. But hey, that's just a theory. The shift is mentioned again in the one theory left in Shattered Quadrant, built out of the rubble of Submachine Universe. It's a new theory, but we cannot read the bulk of its contents. The writer mentions that a shift happened, and I can only imagine that they're wondering why Submachine Universe is now Shattered Quadrant, if they're even capable of grasping the context in which they really exist. Clearly, the shift concept is the idea of committing the development process to Submachine's heart. It's the canonization of the progression of Submachine's real-world history, in a way that is slightly warped and open to interpretation, but it's there all the same, and part of the Submachine world's history forever. I can't fully grasp how beautiful of a thing it is that Mateusz has been so reflective and loving of his own work that he has decided to inscribe a love letter to itself within itself, and then allowed us to experience it too. The question of whether the writer of the last theory is starting to understand that they're inside a game that has been constantly pored over by thousands of prying eyes and redrawn and redeveloped by a singular developer also makes me ask another question. If Shattered Quadrant is just the next evolution of Submachine Universe, then is Submachine Legacy, as a whole, not in fact the singular true Submachine experience, but just the latest evolution of the concept that includes the line of HD versions and original standard definition versions found on websites back in the day. Given everything that we've seen, I cannot see it any other way. And if we assume that to be true, then it is much easier to recontextualize this latest version from being not just a version that's spruced up and more marketable for consumers on a gaming platform, where Mateusz gets to go wild with decorating it with a sense of adventure, of a grand journey, and doesn't worry as much as to why the layers and karma portals and stuff don't exactly jive with each other anymore, but instead as the latest chapter itself in the Submachine story, one that is a celebration of everything that came before it, where you can embark on the journey surrounded with hints of things that used to exist differently, and allow you to probe deeper and perhaps look further back in time, uncover more history as you seek out the older versions for answers to lingering questions that you may have. And when you do, I think you'll begin to understand why you see the green lights in all of these different places. Look at what has changed between the legacy version and the versions that came before, and you'll realize that the lights have a very high correlation with significant changes that were made by the subnet to prepare itself for Legacy's arrival. Even though Mateusz Skutnik himself tells people that Submachine Legacy is the version of Submachine that they should play if they're new to the series, I don't believe that's the only thing that he wants. I think he wants to keep the door open so that others are invited to experience everything that he has had to give over the course of 20 years of developing these games. He has been so committed to sharing the worlds that he's created and the stories that he's told, and to understand and appreciate it fully is to seek out all of it. And I am so thankful that I got to experience it and be part of the conversation, and to have it be part of the conversation of my own life as well. There really has been nothing like it. And with that, I think I've said what I needed to say about what I think about Submachine Legacy and Submachine broadly. There are more things I could talk about that I should mention briefly before I wrap up. I didn't talk about the changes to the puzzles at all because this video is long enough as is, but I did want to mention that I personally actually had a bit of an active role in the redesign of these puzzles. I reached out to Mateusz in good nature while the game was being developed, using my status as prominent guy in the community to make suggestions for improving a lot of the puzzles to make them more accessible and a bit more intuitive for first-time viewers. I thank Mateusz for being gracious enough to allow me to send him my suggestions, and I also want to make clear that at the end of the day, he's the developer who decides what to sign off on for his own game, so all the credits for changes go to him. I'll make that document available for extra reading, possibly including Mateusz's comments on my suggestions as well, if you want to read those. I really like some of what came out of this process, and there are also some things that frustrated me to no end, if I'm being honest. Like, for example, it is extremely frustrating how every time you have to use a key in Submachine Legacy, this hint system shows you a little picture of the key, or the hammer, or the karmic vessel, or any item that you need in certain situations that is either so obvious as to be supremely redundant, or a situation that just solves the puzzle for you immediately. I think it's a really bad addition to the game, but I'm also 99% sure I know exactly why he added this. Come find me in the comments for the answer. I could also talk about other trivial things too, like how I have issues with how there are certain locations missing that make Mataush's claim that every location he's ever drawn in Submachine history being in Legacy untrue, or how the official soundtrack has naming issues and also is not really complete as is suggested by the Submachine Complete title, and how I've actually been discussing with Thumpmonks how to make a better, more detailed and expanded Submachine Complete Soundtrack 2.0. You know, just little things like that. Again, come find me in the comments if you're interested. If you've made it through this entire video, I thank you so much for hearing what I have to say, and for allowing me to share my thoughts and feelings with you for all of the games that I've talked about between Part 1 and 2, and especially Submachine. I hope you understand fully why I went to the lengths that I did in making this, and it's because I think it's important that we understand each other better through the deeply intimate experiences we have with each other's artistic creations. I'm extremely grateful that I've been able to spend the time that I have with not just these games, but games from everywhere, including the Flash era, CD-ROMs, my trusty GameCube and Wii games as well. I would make videos encapsulating all those experiences as well, but unfortunately I've just run out of time. You'll have to find me in a parallel universe to get that 3-hour video essay on Croc, unfortunately. This is not time that I take for granted. I've been very happy with the fact that I've spent my time gaming by exploring stories and worlds that really mean something to me and that give me things to think about and appreciate and treat my time as precious and not just wasting countless hours doing the same thing over and over with minimal engagement because I have nothing better that I want to do. I wish I could give the Submachine Legacy treatment to every game that I've ever played. It would be respecting the games much more than a simple review could ever do, and it's light years ahead of some of what passes for engaging dialogue about games these days. Please avoid looking into alternate timeline where I review Submachine by saying, this is a game about how a white man is the bad guy and he has to be rescued by a time-traveling biracial woman before he destroys everything. Therefore, the game is bad because it's woke. 0 out of 10. Next game, please. Hopefully, in the future, we can be a bit more serious about how we're spending our time. That's all I've got to say about video games. I've still got my short list of games that I hope to play someday. It's a really short list, and I'm not looking to add to it much in the future. You know I'll be playing Submachine the Engine and the Daymare Town remaster when they come out. You know that I'm silently cheering on Memory of a Broken Dimension and Moshe Link's upcoming title Neon Entropy, as well as Playdead's third game. Hopefully those will all see the light someday. And I'm unabashedly still silently praying for Half-Life 3. Some things just never die. That's all I have for you. Thank you so much for watching.